you weren't even looking for anything. Or maybe you were, following a feeling you couldn't quite name until you saw it confirmed in writing. Either way, there they are, messages you were never supposed to see. On her phone. And now you can't unsee them. Your hands are probably shaking a little. Your mind is racing through every possible explanation and every worst-case scenario at the same time, contradicting itself from one second to the next. Some part of you wants to march into the next room right now and demand an explanation. Another part of you wants to pretend you never opened that phone at all, because at least a few more hours of not knowing felt survivable compared to this. If you're sitting with this exact moment right now, phone in hand, world tilted sideways, I want you to know something before we go any further. What you do in the next hour matters. Not because there's a perfect way to handle this, but because the instinct screaming loudest at you right now, confront immediately in whatever state you're in, is usually not the instinct that actually serves you best, even though it feels like the only possible response available to you right now. I've talked with a lot of people in exactly this position. Messages just discovered, mind still reeling, trying to figure out what to do in the very next moments. I want to be honest with you before we go any further, because I think you deserve that more than you deserve a comforting oversimplification. I'm not going to tell you what those messages mean. I don't know, and neither do you yet, not fully. What I am going to do is walk you through what tends to actually help in these first hours after finding something like this, and what tends to make the situation harder to navigate later, based on what genuinely serves people in your exact position, rather than what feels most satisfying to do in the very first minute. Right after finding messages like this, there are really only a handful of ways people tend to respond. The first is confronting immediately, in whatever emotional state the discovery has left you in. Walking straight into the next room, phone in hand, demanding answers before you've had any time to process what you just saw. The second is saying nothing at all, pretending you never saw it, forcing yourself back into normal functioning while privately carrying something enormous, completely alone. And the third is giving yourself a brief, deliberate pause to process what you found before approaching the conversation with actual intention rather than pure reaction. I'm not going to tell you which instinct is pulling at you hardest right now. I can't know that from here, and any reaction to this makes complete sense. But I do want to walk you through why that third approach tends to serve people best, even though right now it probably feels like the hardest one to choose. Let's start with why immediate confrontation, however understandable, tends to backfire more often than it helps. In the short term, confronting right now feels like releasing an unbearable pressure. You found something enormous, and every part of you wants it addressed immediately. But the long-term consequence of confronting while still in acute shock is that the conversation tends to go one of two ways, neither of which actually gets you what you need. Either your spouse becomes immediately defensive, shutting down honest disclosure because they're reacting to your anger rather than actually reckoning with what happened, or the conversation explodes into something so chaotic that no real information actually gets exchanged, just raw emotion on both sides. Neither of these outcomes is actually about what you need most right now, which is clarity. A defensive spouse tends to minimize, deflect, or shut down rather than give you honest answers. A chaotic argument tends to produce more hurt without producing more understanding. Both leave you exactly where you started, still not knowing, just now also having had a devastating confrontation on top of it. There's also something practical worth naming. Once you reveal that you know, you can't take that moment back. If there's any chance you'll want more clarity before that confrontation happens, checking for a pattern, understanding the full scope of what you're dealing with, or simply gathering your own thoughts about what you actually want to say, that window closes the instant your spouse knows you've seen something. That's not a reason to be dishonest or secretive indefinitely. It's a reason to make sure the moment you do bring it up is one you've actually chosen, rather than one shock chose for you. This applies even if part of you wants to confront right away, out of a sense that waiting is somehow dishonest or manipulative. It isn't. Taking a short amount of time to gather your own thoughts before a conversation this significant isn't deception. It's simply making sure you're bringing your clearest self to something that deserves it, rather than the most overwhelmed version of yourself that discovery inevitably produces. I also want to name something that might be hard to hear, but I think it matters. The version of yourself reacting right now, in the first minutes after discovery, is not necessarily the version of yourself who's actually going to have the conversation that gets you real answers. Shock produces a narrower, more reactive state of mind than the one you'll have access to even a few hours from now, once the initial wave has had a little time to settle. That doesn't mean suppressing what you're feeling. It means recognizing that feeling it fully and acting on it immediately are two different things, and the gap between them matters here. Now, let's actually look at where each of these three paths tends to lead, starting with the first, confronting immediately, in the raw aftermath of discovery. In the short term, this feels like taking control of an unbearable situation. But I want to be honest about the long-term consequence of that same choice. Confrontations launched from acute shock tend to be remembered, by both people, as chaotic rather than clarifying. Accusations flying, details getting confused, real questions never actually getting asked because the conversation never settles into anything coherent enough to actually answer them. Even months later, people often describe wishing they'd had that first, most important conversation differently, once the initial devastation had a chance to settle even slightly. I want to be fair to this path, though, because there's no truly wrong timeline for confronting something this significant. Some people genuinely do need to address it immediately to function at all, and forcing yourself to wait when you can't actually bear the silence isn't necessarily better. The key isn't the exact timing. It's whether the confrontation, whenever it happens, comes from a place where you can actually hear the answers you're asking for, rather than one so overwhelmed that nothing said in response will actually register. The second path, saying nothing and pretending you didn't see it, tends to feel protective in the very short term, and increasingly unbearable the longer it continues. In the short term, avoiding the confrontation altogether spares you from having to face what you found, even for a little while. But the long-term consequence of carrying this discovery in complete silence is that it doesn't actually resolve anything. It just adds the weight of your own secrecy on top of whatever you're already carrying, while the underlying situation continues exactly as it was, unaddressed and unaffected by your silence. I think of a situation I've seen more than once, with the details changed but the shape kept intentionally similar. Someone who found messages and, in the initial shock, said absolutely nothing, going through an entire week pretending normal life was happening while privately unraveling. By the time the conversation finally happened, the pressure of holding it in for so long had turned what could have been a direct, honest exchange into something far more explosive, fueled by a week's worth of accumulated silence, rather than the original discovery itself. The week of pretending everything was normal had, in some ways, become almost as exhausting as the original discovery, adding its own separate weight to something that was already heavy enough on its own. The third path, giving yourself a brief, deliberate pause before approaching the conversation with actual intention, tends to give you the best chance at getting real, usable information, rather than just an emotional collision. This doesn't mean waiting indefinitely or pretending you're fine. It means taking even a few hours, or a day if you can manage it, to let the most acute shock settle, to get clear on what you actually saw and what you actually want to ask before bringing it to your spouse. I think of another situation, again with the details changed, but the shape kept intentionally similar. Someone who found messages and, instead of confronting immediately, wrote down exactly what they'd seen and what questions actually mattered most to them, giving themselves a single day before bringing it up. When the conversation happened, it was calmer, more specific, and produced far more actual clarity than the version that would have happened in the first raw hour ever could have. Writing things down beforehand specifically helped them stay focused during the actual conversation, rather than getting swept into whatever direction the discussion happened to drift, which is easy to happen when emotions are running this high on both sides. I know that not knowing right now feels almost unbearable, and only you know exactly what you actually saw and how it's landed. I can't know that from here, and I wouldn't presume to. But if you want something that walks you through this more deeply, a way to actually work through how to approach this conversation once you're ready, I put together 3 step-by-step guides for every stage of a marriage crisis, including exactly this kind of moment, the Complete Marriage Rescue Trilogy. It's linked in the first comment below, whenever you're ready to look at it. Now, let's keep going. Here's the part I really want you to sit with before we finish today. What you do in the next few hours matters more than what happens in this very first moment. You're allowed to take a beat, even a brief one, before this conversation happens. And doing so isn't weakness or avoidance. It's giving yourself the best possible chance at actually getting the answers you deserve. I'm not here to tell you what those messages actually mean or what to do about your marriage. That depends on information only an honest conversation can actually reveal. Nobody outside your situation, including me, gets to interpret it for you sight unseen. But if you do want support thinking this through, a clear way to understand how to approach this moment and what to actually ask, that's exactly what the Complete Marriage Rescue Trilogy was built for. It's not a lecture telling you to stay calm when you don't feel calm, and it's not a script telling you exactly what to say tonight. It's 3 guides that walk you through this specific situation, one piece at a time, at whatever pace this actually requires, without demanding that you have this figured out before you're actually ready. It's linked in the first comment below. Take your time with it. Go look at it when you're actually ready. There's no rush on my end, and there shouldn't be on yours either. Before you go, I want to leave you with this. Whatever you're feeling right now, rage, disbelief, a strange numbness, all of it at once, is a completely normal response to something no one should have to discover. There isn't a perfect way to handle the next few hours, and I'd be lying if I told you there was one. What matters is that you give yourself a real chance to think before you act, rather than letting the shock of this moment make a decision that the calmer version of you, even just hours from now, might approach very differently. If any part of what I talked about today feels like exactly where you are right now, I want you to know you're not alone in this, even though it probably feels that way tonight. Wherever you are in this moment, you're allowed to take the time you need before this conversation happens. That alone is a reasonable, protective thing to give yourself right now, even if it's the last thing your instincts want to hear at this exact minute.